Right, so this is the second unit, environmental flow concepts, and I've called this this talk "Keeping Rivers Alive: Sustaining River Flows for People and Nature," and it introduces the idea of environmental flows and gives you a bit of background. Talks briefly about the kinds of methods that are used, but I'll go into those in more detail in further lectures. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about rivers and their catchments, balancing resource use with protection, which is what environmental flows are about, and environmental flows for rivers. And I look on environmental flows for rivers as the carrying capacity or the speed limit for the river. And the carrying capacity means how much can you use it without unacceptably degrading or changing the river. And the speed limit idea is the analogy that all our cars, when they're new, can go 180, maybe 200 kilometers an hour, but we don't drive them at that speed, because if we did, we might get there quicker, but we might kill ourselves, the car might be destroyed or break down, and that's why we have speed limits, okay? Not for economic reasons or anything like that, but to protect ourselves as a resource. So when we're talking about rivers, the environmental flows means this is how far you can use the river. Okay, you could take all the water out and just put sewage into the river, but that wouldn't be very sensible, although that is what happens from time to time. But so the environmental flow is assessing how much can you use the river and still protect the goods and services that it provides. Okay, now if we look at rivers, they're really very often the centre of our civilizations, the centre of our cultures. So what would London be without the River Thames, for instance? What would Cairo be without the Nile? Well, it wouldn't be there at all. What would Rome be without the River Tiber? Great historical and cultural river in the history of Rome. So rivers are very central to the way we live, to our cultures, to our civilizations, and therefore we need to protect them. Okay? And it's not just the big cities, but a lot of rural populations live next to and depend on their rivers being in a reasonable state. Okay, so there are lots of different sorts of rivers. Here's the Sabi River, which I introduced in the last section, which is a not very modified from natural, a river in a national park. Here's a highly modified river. This is a dam on the Krishna River in India. And that's the kind of major modifications that we've made to many of our rivers nowadays. This is the ultimate modification of a river, if you like. This is this is a tributary of the River Conchos flowing through Chihuahua, the town of Chihuahua, which has simply been canalized and has really no ecosystem left in it, just some wastewater flowing down a concrete ditch. Okay, a number of rivers nowadays which used to flow full-time, like the Rio Conchos in Mexico, are now dry in many of their sections during the dry season because of abstraction, in this case for irrigation. And here two of the members of our environmental flow assessment team looking for where the water has gone from the Rio Conchos. This is me and a colleague in the Great Ruaha River in Tanzania, another perennial river which now no longer flows during the dry season because of abstraction for rice growing upstream. This is the Gambhiri River in India, which used to again be a perennial river flowing into a wetland national reserve, which is now so dry that they've even given up growing crops in the riverbed, and in fact the only use for this riverbed now is used for burying people because it's so dry because of upstream abstraction. The Luvuvu River in South Africa during the worst drought on record in the early 1990s was completely dry, again a perennial river until the late 1960s when abstraction and commercial forestry used up the water during the dry season. But this river was dry during this drought for 14 months, and not just the fish and the hippos and crocodiles, because this is again in the Kruger National Park, but even the riparian trees were dying off because their roots were no longer reaching the groundwater. So there are a number of rivers, and even very big rivers like the Yellow River in China, which were flowing full-time and are now dry for parts of the year, or have been. In terms of the Yellow River, they've now reinstituted some dry season flows. But it is a characteristic of many of the rivers around the world that they've been changed from perennial to seasonal rivers, and sometimes with no water in the channel at all. And a river with no water in the channel is of no use to the biota, no use to the fish, no use to the vegetation, no use to the invertebrates, but no use to the people downstream either. So it's not a sensible way to manage rivers. Of course, there are many other things that we do to degrade rivers in terms of water quality as well as quantity. This is a classic case of catchment mismanagement in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. This is the Mbashi River, which has no dams on it, isn't being used at all, but because of the land degradation, you can see there are no trees whatsoever. The land's very much overgrazed, high density cattle grazing particularly. And this is what the river now looks like, with almost no life left in the river because it's got so much sediment from these erosion gullies. There's no riparian vegetation. It's a river which isn't being used but has almost been destroyed even so. This is an interesting river. This is the Berg River in the southwestern Cape of South Africa, which looks to be in a good state, except that all the riparian trees that you see are not non-native. They're all introduced trees. The fish in the river are mostly non-native, things like trout and smallmouth bass, which have been put in for angling, and even the water in this river is actually coming via an interbasin transfer from a neighbouring river. So this looks nice, but in fact is a completely artificial system. Here's an example of some really not very sensible irrigation. It's basically a farmer growing potatoes on a sand dune and irrigating with scarce groundwater to grow his potatoes in temperatures which were over 30 degrees at the time that I took this picture. Okay, so what are environmental flows? The quality, quantity and distribution of water required to maintain the components, functions and processes of aquatic ecosystems on which people depend. The process of assessing environmental flows will require a societal judgment about the state in which an ecosystem should be maintained. And the quality, quantity and distribution of water required for any aquatic ecosystem will depend on the environmental objectives, which I talked about in the last lecture, set for that system. So what I want to highlight there is it's not just about the quantity, it's also about the quality of water and the distribution through time. The different flows in different seasons and during different years, required to maintain components, functions and processes on which people depend. Okay, this is often thought to be a nature conservation issue, but it's actually a people issue because people depend on rivers. And it's partly a scientific process, the assessment of the flows necessary to achieve particular objectives, but the objectives need a societal judgment. They need the stakeholders to decide what state do they want this river to be in, what do they want to get out of the river. And so those environmental objectives have to be set in order to know what the flow regime should be to meet them. Okay, now it's also environmental flows or environmental water allocation, which is the generic term, isn't just about rivers, it's also about groundwater, wetlands, lakes, estuaries, about water quantity and quality, but this lecture will mainly concentrate on water quantity for rivers, which is perhaps the most developed aspect of environmental water allocation. Okay, now if we look at what happens when you take water out of a river, so this is the percentage of flow abstracted along the x-axis from naught along this end to 100% on the other end, total removal of all water from the river, and then the percentage of economic gain or environmental degradation as you take more and more water out of the river. And what you can see there is that there aren't, as far as we can measure, very identifiable thresholds. Okay, there's a gradual increase in environmental degradation, and the rate of degradation increases the more water you take out, and there's a gradual decrease in the increased economic gain that you get as you take more and more water out, because when you start taking water out of a river, it's very easy. You can just lead it off by gravity. You don't have to have any big structures or anything. But as you take more and more water out, you need storage structures, pumping, and so on. It becomes much more expensive, and the economic gains are less and less relative. Okay, so if you look at the first 30%, let's say, 30% being a fairly arbitrary figure, you've got very low environmental costs usually and large economic gains. But when you start taking the last bit of water out of the river, again, the last 30% for argument's sake, the rate of environmental degradation increases exponentially for very small economic gains. So in terms of environmental flows, you would normally, depending on the objectives for the river, not want to be in that last 30%. You're only going to be in that first 30% for rivers which have a high protected status and aren't being used very much. So normally the environmental flows would probably sit somewhere between those two red lines. Okay, so water resource use and protection, and this is the balance that we're trying to achieve with environmental flows. We're not saying that rivers mustn't be used, they must be used, people depend on them, but the level to which they're used depends on how much they need to be protected. So water resource protection assures long-term or sustainable resource use. But generally, resource use reduces ecosystem health. So resource use has to be balanced with resource protection. And I want to talk a little bit about how you do that. Okay, one of the overarching issues that is being developed really worldwide is water resource classification. And I'll give two examples here. This is the one from South Africa, where they have 4 general classes: natural, good, fair, and poor, where natural is for fully protected rivers, good is for rivers to be kept in a good or only slightly modified state. Fair would be what we call workhorse rivers, rivers which are going to be used quite extensively for irrigation, for industry, maybe urban rivers and so on. And rivers in a poor state are reckoned to be unsustainable, unacceptable, and need rehabilitation to at least a fair state. So that's one example. Another example would be from the EU Water Framework Directive. They have a classification system quite similar, okay, where they have 5 classes: high, good, moderate, poor, and bad state, where high is totally undisturbed, good means slight alterations from the natural state, moderate is moderate, poor is major alterations, and a bad state is with severe alterations. And under the EU Water Framework Directive, the only acceptable classes are high and good. Okay, so anything below a good status requires some restoration, and the framework directive has required that all EU water bodies should achieve good conditions by 2015, okay, which is fairly inflexible and quite ambitious, but there we go. Okay, so if we break down the process of environmental flows into a number of fairly simple questions, they're simple questions, the answers aren't usually very simple at all, but we can actually characterize the general process in terms of a number of questions. Okay, so first of all, what was the system like? And this we refer to as the reference conditions. Okay, and that is not what you're aiming for necessarily, but that gives you a baseline to then look at what's it like now, the present ecological state, or how much has it been changed from the reference conditions. And from that, you can decide what condition would we like it to be in. And there you use the classification and objective setting. And those objectives, as I've said, would need to be set by quite a large community of stakeholders. Okay. What flows and water quality are then necessary to make or keep it as we would like it to be? And that's the assessment of the ecological water allocation or environmental flows. And that is a fairly scientific process which we'll talk about later in the course. How important is it to achieve the environmental objectives? That's something we call the ecological importance and sensitivity, which will vary from river to river depending on what it's being used for. Are there protected areas that depend on the river? Are there downstream communities, even marine ecosystems and estuaries that depend on the flows coming into them? Okay, how much will it cost if the environmental objectives are not met? And this is perhaps the area which we're least good at the moment. The environmental cost benefit analysis is not very well developed and doesn't, in my opinion, work very well at the moment. Needs quite a lot more work on it. How can the required flows be provided? The implementation of the environmental flows, which are going to depend either on having some kind of storage so that you can manage the flows, dams, interbasin transfers, or demand management where you can limit the amount of water that people are taking out and the kind of water quality that's maintained. And crucially, how will we know whether the objectives are being achieved? Very important, the monitoring. Without monitoring, we don't know what state the river's in, we don't know whether we're achieving objectives, and so on. Okay, so those are the basic steps in an environmental water allocation or environmental flows. So how do you go about assessing the water quantity necessary for a river? And I'll just go through this briefly now and then maybe in more detail in further lectures. Okay, first thing, there are lots of different sorts of rivers, and even different sections of different rivers are very different. This would be a steep, cascading bedrock mountain stream flowing through forest, very different from this kind of foothill river where you've got the macro channel demarcated by the riparian vegetation, and then within the macro channel you've got a sinuous active channel, this during the low season, flowing through that macro channel, which would fill up during the wet season or during floods. But a much more sediment deposition, much lower gradient, much less canopy, and so on. Okay, and then you've got a deeply incised river, such as this one in a river valley without really much of a floodplain, a result of tectonic uplift and the river then cutting down through the mountain to make its valley. Then you've got these, this is the Murray River in Australia, which is a very low gradient, very extensive floodplains, and there in the inset photo you can see the billabongs or floodplain wetlands, cut-off meanders, which contain a lot of the environmental importance of these type of rivers. So each of these rivers is going to have different requirements, different uses, and require different sorts of protection in terms of environmental flows. Okay, and then even the same river at different times is going to look very different. This was a very large flood in the Umfolozi River in 1984, caused by a cyclone which dropped about 700 millimetres in the of rainfall in the upper catchment in a few hours, and this railway bridge disappeared quite soon after this picture was taken. Here's a naturally seasonal river, again in the Kruger National Park, which consists of isolated pools during the dry season and then flows during the wet season. And you don't want, as I pointed out with the Great Fish River in the previous lecture, to make a seasonal river into a perennial river, any more than you should be making perennial rivers into seasonal rivers. Okay, and here's the satellite imagery of the Mississippi River in the top part of the picture during one of its periodic, very major floods during the 1990s, and then during the normal in-channel flows in the bottom part of the picture, just again illustrating the huge temporal differences in conditions in a lot of these rivers. This is again the Fish River, which, as I pointed out in the first lecture, is a river with too much water in it, a river which used to stop flowing, but now, because of an interbasin transfer for irrigation, is now flows full-time. This is the Sand River, which, as I pointed out in the last lecture, with a lot of sediment and not enough flow to move that sediment through it, so it's a very choked up channel now, with the reeds consolidating the sediment. Okay, so we've got a number of different types of environmental flow assessment methodologies, and what I've done is I've listed them more or less from the least complicated, quickest methods to the most complicated, most expensive and most time requirement methods, and I'll talk about them in a lot more detail in a future lecture. But for the moment, you've got the hydrology-based or lookup table approaches, where you're just using the hydrology and assuming that some kind of mimicry of a natural hydrological process will maintain the habitats and therefore the biodiversity of the river. You've got an extrapolation approach, where you can use the example or the examples of more detailed assessments which have been done on a number of rivers. For instance, there's such a method in South Africa, to correlate for different types of rivers, different types of hydrology, what the flow requirements have been for analogous rivers that have been assessed in detail. Hydraulic rating methodologies, where you're now using some sort of field work to do surveyed cross sections across the river, which provide the relationship between depth, velocities, river width and so on at different flows, and again you can aim to maintain from that the types of habitats which are probably important. Habitat simulation methodologies, I've got a bit of an example, I've talked a little bit about it before, require multiple cross sections to model the hydraulic conditions over a section of river and to match that up with the habitat requirements of target or indicator species. And then holistic methodologies, which tend to use a large number of specialists, 8 or 10 specialists in hydrology, hydraulics, different aspects of ecology, water quality, and the socio-economic and cultural aspects that are important in the river, and those specialists get together and provide a consensus view, usually after quite considerable amount of field work, so that would be quite a complex methodology. The see what happens method is not really a very official method, but has been used and is quite sensible where there is a structure such as a dam that can be manipulated and where you're clear about what the requirements are. So for instance, in an example in the United Kingdom, where they wanted salmon to come back up the river, the dam operator simply let out a flow from the dam, and then the ecologists monitored whether the salmon were coming up the river. If they weren't coming up the river, the dam operator let more water down until the salmon did start to come back up the river. So there, you don't really have an assessment methodology, you have a try it out and see if it works. Empirical sort of methodology. And then what I've called the upside down approach, which is where the burden of proof is actually on the person who wants to develop the river, who wants to take the water out of the river, to show that they're not unacceptably impairing the condition of the river. And that has been tried in Connecticut in the United States, where an initial court case required the developer to show that he wasn't impairing the public trust, but it was overturned in the High Court. But if we think about it, that's where we should be aiming to, where instead of the river having to make a case for its own flows, we should be in line with all the other environmental impact assessment methods, where it's the developer who has the burden of showing that he's not unacceptably degrading the resource that's being used. But as I say, we'll go into more detail of those first 5 types of methodology in a further lecture. Okay, we've looked in the previous lecture at this use of PHABSIM, the model which uses multiple cross-sections to characterize a length of river. The PHABSIM hydraulic part of the model models conditions in each cell of the river, extrapolated from the transects, and then matches those up to the requirements of the indicator species. And what we saw in this case was that for all those 4 indicator species, including hippos, the preferred habitat was reduced quite considerably after the flows were reduced past or below about 3.5 cubic meters per second, giving an idea of the sort of minimal flow that was necessary in the river. So that's one of these habitat simulation methodologies. And there's just an example of a section of the lower Buffalo River at a particular flow, characterized in terms of the different depths and the connectivity of that section of river for fish to be able to swim through it. But all these methods, all the methods which require field work, are basically trying to convert ecological, social, cultural, but mainly ecological information on things like habitat types, ecological processes for indicator species, and they're trying to turn those into hydrology in terms of flows in cubic meters per second, which the managers and the engineers need to be able to know how to manage the river. And the link there is, as I've pointed out, the hydraulics in terms particularly of velocity, depth, substrate type, but also river width and so on, where that can turn the description of a habitat in terms of those issues can then be converted to flows in cubic meters per second. And that's really a common link between the ecology and the hydrology via the hydraulics for almost all the main methods of environmental flow allocation. So those environmental flows are going to be very different for different rivers and for different parts of rivers. For instance, here we have a hypothetical river flowing through a conservation area where you're going to want considerable amounts of the flow in terms of dry season base flows, wet season base flows in red, and intermittent higher flow and flood events to mimic all the natural conditions to provide the mosaic of habitats in time and space required to maintain the biodiversity. By contrast, if you've got a river flowing through an urban area, you might simply want enough flow to maintain reasonable water quality, some recreational fishing habitat, and to make it look nice flowing through parks to provide a bit of a recreational corridor. So you might need much lower base flows and not so many higher flow events, and you've therefore got a lot more of the water that can be taken out and used for industrial or irrigation or domestic use. So the difference between the red line, the environmental flows, and the green line, the natural flows, would be the amount of water available for consumptive use. Again, if we look at, say, a spring-fed river with a less variable flow, then you're going to be concentrating much more on the base flows and much less on the isolated peaks, compared to a temporary river with no flow during the dry season and a rather flashier flood regime, where you're going to be certainly not trying to introduce any base flow where there wasn't any naturally, and concentrating maybe on the higher flow or flood events, which are the main drivers for the system. So different flows for different types of rivers. And crucially, the involvement of stakeholders is very important, especially for setting the objectives for the river, but also for getting buy-in, getting people to understand what environmental flows are about, and getting them to put their support behind maintaining their rivers in a state which is going to provide the priority uses and conditions that they need from the river. So if we look at any sort of typical river, then the people we need really cover the whole spectrum in order to maintain a river, to provide the environmental flows. So we need engineers, hydrologists, geomorphologists, the people who sort out or who can predict what's going to happen to the channel shape and the sediment transport down the river, water chemists for the water quality, hydraulics engineers to provide the modelling to link the ecology to the hydrology. We need sociologists and economists to try and characterise the costs and benefits of the different states of the river. We need different sorts of ecologists, vegetation, invertebrate, fish, even algae and microbiology, to be able to characterise the biodiversity and the ecological processes in the river. We need legislators and managers to provide a policy framework within which the various specialists can work, and crucially the different types of stakeholders. So environmental flows is a genuinely multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary undertaking, and requires a lot of knowledge from a lot of different disciplines to make it work properly. Now, the other issue that I just want to touch briefly on is that when environmental flows was first developed or thought of, it was very much thought of as a hydroecological or eco-hydrological process where we just needed to match up the ecology with the hydrology. And then the early methods, like in the mid-1970s, when environmental flows were really being thought about and methodologies developed, were really concentrating simply on the ecology and hydrology. What we realised was the link provided by the hydraulics, the importance of the sediment transport in the long-term shaping of the river, and that the water quality was a very important issue. And what we also realised that we needed to take into account social aspects and human well-being. But this was initially really a bit of an add-on rather than a central part of the process. But what we soon realised is that you can have the best science in the world, the best understanding of the processes and the ecology and the hydrology and so on in the river, but if you don't get the people on board, it's not going to work. So then there was a realization that the social aspects, the human well-being, stakeholder participation, and economic analysis is really an overarching framework for the scientific work of assessing and implementing the flows, and also that you can't look at environmental flows in isolation. You need to look at it in terms of the overall management of the water resources of any particular catchment, and best in an integrated water resource management framework. So those, I would suggest, would be that would be the sort of conceptual framework that we need to operate environmental flows in nowadays. And then what we also need to realise is that this doesn't happen overnight. It requires a lot of time and effort and education and capacity building to get people on board, to get the policy framework, and to get the implementation going. So this was the mid-1980s, surveying the Sabi River to start to do some work on environmental flows, which took until 1998 when the new South African Water Act was developed, and within that Water Act the reserve was developed, consisting of the needs for basic human use of water for washing and drinking and so on, and the ecological reserve, which relates to the water required to protect the aquatic ecosystems of the water resource, in the words of the 1998 Act. And that was, as far as I know, the first time that environmental flows were included specifically in legislation. And nowadays, most countries around the world are now including that kind of environmental requirement in their new policy and legislation. But it took over a decade to get to that act, and it's taken quite a long time. So last year, I stood on the new Berg River Dam, releasing an environmental flow, this dam was built specifically to be able to provide, as well as irrigation flows and so on, to be able to provide the different kinds of environmental flows, the low flows and the higher flows through specially designed radial gates. So there you're talking about nearly 25 years from the initial fieldwork and research to actually allocating the water. And it doesn't need to take quite that long, but it does need a full process to get people on board and to get them taking part. So when we were working on the Ganga River in India, one of the specialists was a very wise man, Ravi Chopra, director of People's Science Institute, who was working on some of the social and cultural aspects of the river. And following our assessment workshop, he said this: when we come up with the flow requirements to sustain the social and ecological systems of the Ganga, don't imagine that our government will immediately understand and accept our recommendations. They will not quickly change their management priorities and policies. But what we are doing here is to plant a seed, and if we nurture and look after the seedling, then maybe in the next 20 years we will see gradual changes that will fulfill our vision for a sustainable and healthy river that flows from the headwaters to the sea. Thank you.